This is a podcast discussing the sermon entitled Compassionate Care and God's Miraculous Power, given by Cy Lynch, Senior Pastor of Trinity Baptist Church in Conyers, Georgia. Listen to this discussion and then listen to the sermon on YouTube.
We all want to cut through the noise, right? To really grasp the heart of a story and what it means for, how we navigate our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's exactly what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into some excerpts from a sermon. It's called Compassionate Care Reveals God's Power.
And this wasn't just like abstract thinking. The sermon itself, it was delivered on Mother's Day.
Yeah.
And just moments before the speaker started, they actually learned about a baby being born right there in their community.
Wow, talk about timing.
Exactly. A really tangible picture of new life right as they're about to talk about, God's power and compassionate care.
It's such a powerful real-world backdrop. And this sermon, it's part of a bigger conversation they were having, looking at how Jesus' resurrection impacts our everyday lives.
Right. They'd already talked about things like being loved, finding freedom, having a purpose.
So today we're focusing on this specific piece, how compassionate care can be a genuine, demonstrable force in the world, something real.
A force that was apparent back then, in the time the sermon talks about, but also feels, pretty relevant right now, given all the unrest and needs we see.
Definitely. So our mission, if you like, is to really unpack this idea, compassionate care as a powerful agent. What are the key insights here?
Okay, so to get into it, the sermon first sets the scene. It takes us back to the early days of the Christian movement, time described in the book of Acts.
Right. Peter and the apostles are out there spreading the word. Lots of people are coming to faith, a time of real growth.
And it zooms in on a specific story happening in a town called Joppa. It involves a group of widows, and they were being looked after, really served, by a woman named Tabitha. She was also known as Dorcas.
Tabitha or Dorcas, okay. And it sounds like she was pretty central to that community, more than just, helpful.
Oh, absolutely. The sermon really emphasizes the shockwaves her unexpected death sent through the Christian community there. The grief was intense. And, often when people read this part of Acts, the focus tends to be on Peter, what he does next.
Right. But the sermon deliberately shifts our focus. It wants us to look at Tabitha, at the power that was evident in her compassionate actions before Peter even arrived.
Okay, I like that shift. So let's dig into Tabitha herself. The sermon paints her as, a mentor, kind of mother figure, and definitely a provider for these widows.
Yeah, and not just in a passive way. It wasn't like she just noticed they had needs. She actively sought them out and served them.
How so? What did that look like?
Well, the sermon highlights the depth of her investment. She used her own resources, money, yes, but also materials to make clothes, like tunics and robes, which were essential items.
Okay, so practical help.
Very practical. But crucially, it was also her personal labor, her time, her effort. It was hands-on care, not just, sending aid from a distance.
That makes a difference. And you mentioned the community's reaction to her death. It wasn't just appreciation. Exactly. The sermon points out their sorrow seemed to go much deeper than just losing practical help. There was real love there, deep affection. It suggests the quality of her relationships, the connections she built.
Yeah, that says a lot.
And the sermon gets into the language, actually. The original Greek used to describe her good deeds. It's interesting.
Oh, how so?
The grammar suggests it wasn't just like isolated acts of kindness. It implies a continuous, ongoing pattern. It was part of who she was, just flowing out of her consistently.
Ah, so integral to her character.
Precisely. And that connects to this phrase the sermon uses, lives overflowing and building bridges. Her generosity wasn't a special occasion thing. It was her baseline, constantly reaching out and connecting her with others.
Love's overflowing and building bridges. I like that. So Tabitha herself, as a woman in that society, might have been somewhat on the margins?
That's a fair assumption.
Oh.
And yet, she specifically reached out to another group that was often marginalized, widows. And the sermon connects this back briefly to an earlier issue in Acts chapter 6. There was concern about widows not getting a fair share of resources.
Ah, yes. That led to the role of the deacon, didn't it? The servant role.
Exactly. And the sermon suggests that while Tabitha might not have had that official title, her actions were, in essence, the work of a deacon. She was serving, meeting a critical need right there in her community.
And what about her names, Tabitha and Dorcas? You said the sermon touched on that.
Yeah, it's quite intriguing. Tabitha is Hebrew or Aramaic. Dorcas is Greek. Joppa, where they lived, was a port city.
So cosmopolitan, lots of different influences.
Very much so. Significant Greek influence, even among the Jewish population. So having both names probably meant she could connect with more people. She could literally bridge those cultural and language divides within her own community. Hebrew Aramaic speakers and Greek speakers.
That's fascinating. She's building bridges in multiple ways then.
Seems like it.
The sermon also mentions Peter's journey, coming from Lida to Joppa. What's the significance there?
Well, partly it just shows the geographical spread, you know. The movement wasn't just stuck in Jerusalem, it was expanding.
Right.
But the sermon also kind of hints that Peter himself was on a learning curve. Like Tabitha, he was perhaps learning to see past certain biases, recognizing that God works through all sorts of people, women, people from different cultural backgrounds.
Right. His perspective was broadening too. Okay, so Tabitha dies, and the community, the church in Joppa, they don't just, well, mourn passively.
No, they act immediately. They send guys to Lida to get Peter.
And the message is urgent, right? Bring him here at once.
Exactly. That urgency really suggests they had this hope, maybe even a belief, that Peter could actually do something, that maybe this wasn't the end of the story for Tabitha.
What does that tell us? About community, maybe?
Yeah, the sermon really draws out that lesson, the strength of their community, for one. But also, their instinct wasn't to just handle it alone. They reached out for help at a crisis.
Don't go it alone when things get tough.
Right. And even when Peter arrives and, performs what looks like a miracle, the sermon points out how he does it. He doesn't rely on his own power.
He prays first.
He kneels and prays.
Yeah.
He explicitly connects with Jesus as the source of the power. So even in that seemingly miraculous moment, there's this reliance on something or someone bigger.
Which connects back to what you said earlier about faith not being a solo journey. It's lived in community, relying on a higher power.
Exactly. And this whole situation naturally brings up that big question the sermon asks directly. Do you believe in miracles?
Yeah, that's a fundamental one. How does the sermon approach it?
Well, it frames miracles in the Bible not as just like random magic tricks, but as specific demonstrations of divine power. And importantly, they usually have a purpose to draw people closer, to deepen their understanding or relationship with God.
Okay, so there's an intent behind them.
Right. The sermon reminds us of another healing Peter did just before this, a paralyzed man in Lida. And the result? The text says many people turn to faith because of it.
And similarly with Tabitha.
Same thing. After she's raised, the news spreads like wildfire through Joppa. And the result is that many people came to believe. So the miracle served a purpose beyond just helping Tabitha.
So the sermon isn't necessarily saying we should expect literal resurrections all the time.
No, it acknowledges that might not be our everyday experience, but it suggests we can see parallels, instances of restoration, new beginnings, new life, happening in many other ways around us.
Okay. And you mentioned the language Peter uses is significant.
Hugely significant. When Peter says to her, Tabitha, get up, the sermon points out the specific Greek word he uses is egeiro.
And that word matters because?
Because it's the exact same verb used over and over again in the New Testament to describe Jesus' own resurrection from the dead.
Wow. Okay, that's not subtle.
Not at all. It creates this powerful echo. The sermon suggests it shows a continuity of that same resurrection power working through the early church. It's like saying the power that raised Jesus is the same power at work here.
And is it just that word, or are there other parallels?
The sermon draws another striking parallel, this time to when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter, which is recorded in Mark's gospel.
How so?
There are similarities in the actions, like Jesus, Peter sends people out of the room, but also linguistically.
Yeah.
Jesus says in Aramaic, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, get up. That kum is related to the word Peter uses. It reinforces that sense of connection, of the disciples continuing Jesus' ministry.
So the big takeaway seems to be that this resurrection power, this power for restoration, isn't just ancient history.
Exactly. The sermon really emphasizes that it's still active today, even in situations that look completely hopeless. It even connects it to things like, say, churches struggling with numbers, suggesting that spiritual renewal, that kind of restoration, is always possible.
And Tabitha's example is key to accessing that or demonstrating it.
Her ethic of service, absolutely. Her compassionate care. The sermon holds her up as a model, especially, in a world that can be very self-focused. It brings us back to that question, do you believe in miracles? And it connects the answer to the call to actually show compassionate care, like in that earlier series on kindness they mentioned.
It's not just about feeling kind, though, is it?
No, the sermon makes a really crucial point there. Showing compassionate care often starts with a choice, a conscious decision. I'm going to choose to be joyful or loving or kind or forgiving or understanding, even when it's hard.
And the idea is when we make that choice.
The implication is that a higher power, God's power, provides the strength, the ability to actually live that choice out, to make it real.
Right.
The sermon apparently even ended with lines from a song about reaching beyond boundaries and learning to love each other.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, the core message from this sermon seems pretty clear.
Yeah, I think so. That compassionate care, the kind Tabitha showed, isn't just a nice thing to do. It can actually be a way that this powerful, life-giving force shows up in the world. Still works today.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? Like, consider the ways that choosing kindness, choosing that compassionate care in your own life, maybe in small ways, might actually, well, reveal some kind of power beyond the ordinary.
Right. How could those actions maybe contribute to a bit of healing or renewal or just new life right where you are?
Yeah. It definitely challenges you to think about what you believe about miracles and how they might actually appear, not just in grand gestures, but in our everyday choices and actions. Something to mull over.